Hello everyone and greetings from Dhaka, Bangladesh. I'm Lamia Mohsin, a Youth Resilience Fellow working with the UN High-Level Climate Champions and a young professional focusing on climate adaptation, resilient livelihoods and public policy. My role as a Youth Resilience Fellow, closely working with the UN High-Level Champions, allows me to reflect on my national identity, as I hail from one of the most climate-vulnerable countries in the world, which is Bangladesh. For countries like ours, there's an urgent need to reduce climate risks for a huge population by systematically mainstreaming climate resilience and integrating nature-based solutions into infrastructure planning, financing, design, operations, and maintenance to ensure new and existing infrastructure is climate resilient. However, the concept of resilient infrastructure itself is yet to be mainstreamed into national climate change discourse, with concerns over how to contextualize the narrative in line with available financing. The infrastructure gap presents a challenge for countries and people, but it also provides an opportunity to ensure that climate change is mainstreamed throughout and within all new infrastructure planning and investments going forward. In addition, with financing resilient infrastructure, assets is critical. It is increasingly important for countries to ensure that these investments translate into resilient and equitable infrastructure services, all of which are supported by a bedrock of strong policy frameworks, which seeks to promote multi-sectoral cooperation in integrating resilience infrastructure in national plans and targets. From a governance and policy perspective, I believe it is high time that we start having the conversations, dialogues, and debates between governments, development partners, and the private sector on accelerating adaptation investments in infrastructure for a climate resilient future. Governments need to be able to assess the climate risk to infrastructure, quantifying the impact of the provision of services at the household level and to the country's development objectives. In collaboration with non-state actors such as civil society, private sector engagement, and private sector, governments can develop a roadmap of adaptation priorities to enhance the resilience of the country's infrastructure. Narrowing down, public-private partnerships are a key entry point to integrate climate adaptation and resilience into infrastructure projects and address climate change impacts. Yet, while there is a strong body of knowledge of guidance for public-private partnership and literature on climate risk, resilience, and infrastructure, countries lack information on how to bring these two fields together. It is therefore vital that countries invest in developing the upstream capacity of practitioners who, with the required knowledge, will be able to relate the unique governance settings while developing a strategy to connect the two areas. Climate resilient infrastructure is quickly starting to be mainstream in a general investment practice in institutions, organizations, and communities who are beginning to acknowledge the need to adapt to the impacts of climate change. We need to make sure that this change is being reflected in governance systems all across the world equitably, with none being left behind. Thank you.
Welcome back. We've just heard from Lamia Mohsin, Climate Champion Youth Fellow in Resilience. Thank you, Lamia, for sharing your thoughts with us today. It now brings me great pleasure to introduce our final panel session of the summit, Making the Business Case for Sustainable and Resilient Infrastructure. This session will be a panel discussion and a Q&A, so please start thinking about questions you would like to pose to the speakers shortly. I'm delighted to announce that we'll be hearing from Tom Lewis, Julia Macanio, and Abhilash Panda in this session that will be moderated by Andy Deacon. Andy is the acting director of the Global Covenant of Mayors and Climate and Energy, GCOM for short, and has been part of the GCOM Secretariat team since January 2020. And he's working to guide program management and delivery across all of GCOM's areas of activity. He has worked for 25 years across a range of environmental protection issues, focusing on climate change, energy, and air quality in local, regional, and central government, academia, and NGOs. After the panel session, we will hear from our ICSI Vice Chair, Kian Gunalan, who will bring the summit to a close and share some reflections on the event. This is the last time you hear from me. I'd like to thank you all for participating, and I hope we can keep these important conversations going within the engineering and the infrastructure communities. Please stay in touch and follow our work. There will be opportunities to engage in the coming months. That's all from me, and over to you, Andy, for the final session.
Thank you, Savina, and welcome from Katowice in Poland. I'm here also joining virtually this summit, but then here in person as part of the World Urban Forum. and has been fascinating over the past few days to really be part of some key discussions that are getting very much into those issues you heard from our youth speaker on the video there, introducing things at the beginning. Both then dealing with issues of multi-level governance, challenges of urban infrastructure, and really in recognition of the multiple challenges that cities are facing currently, dealing with recovery from the COVID crisis, now both the direct in the case of Ukraine, but then also indirect impacts of the conflict, both hearing from Polish cities about their work to accommodate many millions of refugees who have crossed the border, but then more broadly now impacts on the world's energy and food systems. And urban leaders are really striving to deliver the sustainable and resilient infrastructure that underpins their ability to deal with many of those systems. And I'm delighted that we've got such an esteemed panel together in order to debate and discuss some of those and many other issues. But really, we're here to talk about making the business case for sustainable and resilient infrastructure. And during the course of last year, the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure published a white paper on green recovery and finance for sustainable infrastructure. And just to set the scene, I'd like to share a couple of slides and just walk through then the findings of that activity. So let me see if this is going to work, which it doesn't look like it is at the moment. So I'll come to that work in a moment, just while I grapple with some technical issues on my side. But three excellent panelists who are here. And I'll come to them one by one. First of all, with the same question for each speaker. Come first to you, Abhilash, with those kind of current multiple challenges facing the world and private sector commitments to climate change targets globally. What do you see as the biggest issue in making the business case for sustainable and resilient infrastructure? Over to you for some perspectives.
Right. Thank you for the question, Andy. It's nice to see as my fellow panelists, and also thanks for the invite to speak at this very interesting session. I guess the question in itself has already raised a question on in the integrities of the details of things. Business case for sustainable and resilient infrastructure. I don't think there is a difference between sustainable and resilience in it when it comes to infrastructure. They are supposed to be they should go hand in hand. They are like the two sides of a coin, right? You know, you cannot be sustainable without being resilient, or you cannot be resilient without being sustainable. I mean, yet if we look at some statistics, roughly, this is a pre-COVID calculation which said that roughly $90 trillion is required in investment into infrastructure over the next 15 years. And I think it was based around for the SDG 9 in addressing some of those. But yet at the same time, we also know that infrastructure disruptions cost roughly $400 billion in a year, and mostly in the low and middle income countries. So there is kind of a dichotomy here, right? You know, when we know there's so much investments to be going into infrastructure, yet we are seeing increasing losses and just being generating from the disruption of services. Business case is, I mean, it's a question which comes across multiple facets of investment decisions. When you talk to the public sector, there is this issue of understanding of risk and the implication of those risks into infrastructure decisions. When you talk to the private sector, there is the issue of the regulatory framing of some of these things. But we also know that investment in resilient infrastructure are not just important for the to address the obstacles that we are currently looking at. They are somewhere not taking into account the short-term thinking issues, the untested assumptions, the lack of local institutional capacity, policy, and as I mentioned, the regulatory frameworks and investment decisions. Now, short-term thinking is a major challenge that we have come across in multiple instances. Predominantly, it calls for an event that might never happen, and in most cases, driven by lack of visible and well-communicated incentives. Although I must say there has been substantial progress in upgrading investment into risk prevention or ex-ante risk reduction over the last few years, there is still a serious bias towards reliance on ex-post investments, that is purely response, reconstruction, and rebuilding things. Now, what we also see that there is a lack of common understanding of what is resilient infrastructure. Now, through our engagement with member states, we have found out that one of the key issues in infrastructure resilience arena is a shared view of what infrastructure is in scope. The extent of resilience, what do you mean by resilience? The scale and ambition of resilience, or for that matter, sustainability. The definition of resilience and what can be done to improve infrastructure resilience. The current approach of infrastructure planning, financing, design, development, operations, the young, the lady from Bangladesh mentioned some of the issues that she is seeing. But if you take all of these factors into account, they don't fully take into consideration either the interdependent nature of infrastructure and services or the increasing complex nature of risk and the cascading impacts that a disaster can have on the whole infrastructure system. Somewhere down the line, we need to put forward a think resilience approach across all decision-making processes. Now, the business case has to take that into account. It's not just about the cost benefit at that point of time. What is the cost now, and what are the benefits that potentially this investment is going to generate in the future, in the long-term basis also. We also looking at the bond market, let's say, right? We yet do not see a big jump on resilience around it. The climate bonds and the issuance around the climate bonds of those is still heavily towards mitigation, which is definitely required, but we still need to take resilience as a factor into it. Now, this is a narrative that still needs to be understood and addressed. Now, to address some of these critical issues and to ensure that investments will be resilient to current and future hazards, we not only need to we not only need to look at how do we understand the resilience of infrastructure, but we also need to work towards a set of criteria that increase awareness and build a common understanding around it. So UNDRR, with some of our partners, which includes ICSI, has been trying to put forward what's called the principles of resilient infrastructure. And we hope that these principles will help towards building a pipeline of robust infrastructure investments. I'll end by saying that all of these are multiple issues. They're interconnected. They jump from one ministry, one sector, one investor to another potential shareholder. But one thing that we have seen across all the avenues is that in most countries, risk assessments or understanding of critical infrastructure risk exposure only take current hazards into account. They yet do not take into consideration what's coming in the future. And that's going to create more challenges for us as we go in and create arguments of why investments in resilient and sustainable infrastructure is critical. Off to you, Andy. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Abhilash. And it's been great to engage with some of your colleagues here, in particular in relation to the Making Cities Resilient 2030 program, and to hear again from some city leaders about how these compound impacts are forcing them to have to more routinely revisit their future scenario and strategy planning. And really, to your point at the end there, that kind of vision that's coming, trying to look forward is becoming increasingly difficult, but the concept of building resilience overall to shocks of any kind becoming increasingly important. And also the ability to deal with those compound risks that you identified also. So no, thank you for those remarks, and we'll come back to you in a moment with another more specific question that will follow on. But next I want to come to Julia Macagno from the European Investment Bank. Julia, to open, kind of same question for you. What do you see as the biggest issue in making the business case for sustainable and resilient infrastructure?
Well, Thank you, Andy. First of all, I think, I mean, there are a number of things indeed, as Abhilash also said. I think the time horizon is key because it depends on what private investor we're talking to or about. I think if we are talking about, let's say, private equity or infrastructure funds, they have an investment horizon of 3 to 5 years, and then they need to exit. And some of the benefits from the resilience, from embedding the resilience into the design of the project, occur later on in time. So I think for some investors there is a mismatch in terms of the horizon. So this is one thing. The other mismatch is between who pays the cost of including the resilience and who reaps the benefits. The benefits are normally diffused and are normally are normally taken by the community, by the residents, by the users of the infrastructure, whereas the costs are paid upfront and by the investor. So again, I think there is a fundamental issue to be solved, and I think the public sector has a big role to play in trying to adjust the incentives to make sure that everybody finds its own benefit in investing and in integrating resilience consideration. So these are two elements. The other thing that I'd like to mention is the adaptation and resilience per se sometimes are capital intensive, but it's not very easy to determine a project, an infrastructure project that is purely adaptation or resilience based. So sometimes it's an add-on that doesn't cost very much to an infrastructure project, but there is also this. So to get an investor to finance, private investor to finance purely adaptation or resilience, it may be difficult because the ticket size of those investments are not necessarily big enough to be attractive. So so I see a number of things that may hinder private sector investors to actually carry out these investments in a certain way. And I would stress the role of the public sector in the sense that there are a number of things that need to be integrated in the procurement of infrastructure projects and need to be monitored or included in the performance of the infrastructure, which is another way of saying, okay, if you don't want to do this because maybe for you it doesn't make business sense, I, as a public entity, want to make sure that these considerations are still mainstream and included, and I do it through a regulatory, in a regulatory form, in a way. I'll stop here for the moment. Thank you.
No, that's perfect. Thank you very much. I'll say a little bit more about the ICSI white paper in a moment, but it very much went down some of those same avenues about trying to make sure that some of those multiple benefit considerations could be built into activity during the pre-development phase and project feasibility and planning, but really then implemented throughout the project life cycle. And that's something that ICSI has continued to return to, is not only thinking about the design and build phases of projects, but also all the way through operation and implementation, and the ability to really track those long-term impacts. Thank you. So then thirdly, we're going to come to Tom Lewis, President of WSP USA and Business Line Executive on Climate Resilience and Sustainability. I think we may have Tom on audio only, but Tom, very much welcome, just to get us kind of warmed up or going a little. Also then your perspectives on what you see as the biggest issues in making the business case for sustainable and resilient infrastructure. Over to you.
Yes, and first I would like to say thank you for you, Andy, and to ICSI for inviting me to speak as a panelist today, and also say that I agree with the important statements and insights that my fellow panelists have already shared, of this question. But now I'd like to bring an infrastructure consulting perspective to the answer to the question. And for our public sector and private sector clients, as infrastructure owners and investors, the biggest challenge I see is keeping up with and reacting to the rapidly changing and very broad spectrum of national and local requirements, global disclosure frameworks such as TCFD and TNFD, the proliferation of all the tools, standards, and rating systems that are out there, all the changing investments and funding priorities, and many other factors that are really a full-time job keeping up with. And at WSP, we try to manage this using what we call our Future Ready framework, which is really more of a mindset that we apply both internally for ourselves, but also externally for our clients. And it's very simple, and I think anybody can apply it. And it really just involves very mindfully and intentionally, before you start making recommendations and decisions, look at the key trends and try to anticipate where things are going to be decades from now, and not just where they are today. And that includes, the regulatory frameworks and everything I mentioned that are rapidly changing, but also things like technology, other factors that can actually make a solution available 10 years from now or 20 years from now that may not be available right now, but actually could be built into your planning, financing, investing, decision-making today, rather than doing things that might foreclose those future options by taking a path today that really limits your future opportunities and options. And this can have huge ramifications on infrastructure planning, design, construction, and long-term operations and maintenance life cycles. Admittedly, though, it's oftentimes easier to say this than to do it. And that's why having an established framework, whether it's something like Future Ready like we use here at WSP, or some other method that can consistently be applied and your people can be trained on, is really critical. And communicating that across your organization and to the infrastructure organizations out there, so that they're not just making decisions based on today's conditions and where we're at today. And this helps you avoid false choices. For example, when people talk about focusing on net zero and climate mitigation as the most important thing, and then those are things that put you out 10, 20, 30 years from now where your net zero commitments are going to be, and really turns potentially a blind eye to the very real impacts that are occurring today with regard to extreme weather, climate change, climate migration, other things that really ethically we cannot ignore, and we cannot assume that they will just be taken care of by others. We have to include that in our climate action programs, so you're covering both climate adaptation and resilience and the climate mitigation elements of climate action. Thanks, Andy.
No, awesome. Thanks, Tom. And I'm going to come back to you in a few moments, just so you're prepped, just to talk about how we can continue to engage more effectively between some of the platforms like the Global Covenant of Mayors and City Leadership, and really tap into some of that expertise and foresight from within the engineering community. But before we do that, I'm going to come back with a second round of specific questions. Then just to very quickly share some material to set out the essence of this ICSI paper on green recovery and finance for sustainable infrastructure. So the URL is on the slide there, and heartily encourage you all to make use of all of the material and resources that's on the ICSI website. But very much this work grew out of some understanding that had developed from a needs assessment, in part conducted by the Global Covenant of Mayors a few years ago in 2018-19, that identified that all the way through the project lifecycle from planning to implementation, there were some critical cycle gaps around project pre-feasibility and project feasibility. So there were missing links early enough in project development to the financial sector. There was little shared ownership of development risks, a feeling that the public sector should be absorbing that, an unwillingness from the private sector to engage earlier in the life cycle. then a feeling that some of the other later stage risks were not being appropriately covered. That basically for some infrastructure projects that were trying to hard bake or build in, then some of those wider co-benefit considerations that wasn't being adequately reflected in the risk return profile of projects. So really an understanding that there was a gap there, and we'll come back with some specific questions about the gap fund in a moment that is partly helping to fulfill that. But the ICSI white paper then pulled together a toolkit, and just quickly want to acknowledge the contribution in particular of key author Amy Shatskin, contributions from GCOM colleagues Asma Gina, at the time Amanda Eichel, communications support from Marnie McGregor, and other colleagues from across the GCOM team to then promote this activity, as well as, of course, Savina and colleagues from the ICSI team, but really a set of recommendations that are there for tools to encourage the identification and allocation of pre-development funding, not only by multinational or multilateral finance institutions, but also from national governments when they're making facilities available, even from some local governments who are pooling finance and funding and trying to build in these considerations of multiple benefits into pre-development funding, and then to private sector project developers too. It set out a set of 3 key asks and recommendations in kind of these 3 buckets, with some much more detailed recommendations and ways forward that sit under them. Firstly, really this opportunity around green recovery. We've heard a lot about the opportunity to build back better or to build back greener, but we really need to still be making the most of recovery funding and financing to really build robust project pipelines, and we made some recommendations about how to do that. Secondly, as a number of our speakers have emphasized already, then there are opportunities to reduce financial risks for implementation of large infrastructure projects, and really the way that we use some of this riskier pre-development finance can help to reduce risks for all of the parties involved in any one project or transaction. And then thirdly, around ensuring the sustainability and resilience of recovery-focused infrastructure packages. And really that's about some of those tools that Tom and others, Abhilash and the team from the UN, as well as the work that EIB is doing through the Gap Fund that we'll come back to in a moment, really are making available to build sustainability considerations into these key infrastructure projects that are being embedded in cities. So there's the URL once more. That's a kind of 2-minute walkthrough of what's in there, but there's an awful lot more detail, and we're looking to continually build on that by identifying individual case studies of implementation and advancing that activity. So then I want to come back very quickly to each of our panelists with a more specific question. So firstly, to come back to you, Abhilash, in just a couple of minutes, what are some of the strategies that you see being identified and put in place to de-risking infrastructure investments, and really what's missing? Who are the key parties in some of those transactions, and what are the tangible actions that they should be taking?
Thanks, Andy. It's an interesting question. There is a problem here, though, which has to do with the understanding of infrastructure disruption and access to service delivery, right? I mean, the Sendai framework, which is basically what UNDRR is response or supports in the implementation, has a specific target on reduction in disruption of infrastructure, critical infrastructure, and reduction in disruption to access of service delivery. Now, there is hardly much of data that we have seen coming from governments on that. Now, when we don't have explicit detailed data coming in, it's very difficult to then understand what's happening in countries. Where do you start from de-risking it? investment decisions, right? Now, let's say hypothetically if we manage to have specific understanding of losses and damages and disruption for specific locations or in specific contexts, then that changes the viewpoint or the engagement process with the financial and the private sector actors, right? But also with the public sector in itself. One strategy that one option that we need to look at is to complement net zero here and to bring something which looks specifically or supports the resilience dimension in that. We are calling it net resilience game from an infrastructure investment perspective. What it means that all intervention, whether be it's a specific action or investment decisions, need to need to make sure that they enhance the systemic resilience of infrastructure and not create any additional risk. It's sort of no regrets approach in all its entirety, but it would go ahead complementing net zero in its processes. So that could somehow support both financial decision making by the private sector, but also by the public sector in de-risking investments. A colleague from EIB mentioned about regulations. Aptly, that's one area that definitely needs further strengthening, not just from the understanding of historical events, but taking into account potential future risks, with scenarios of what could potentially happen, and how the national infrastructure regulations could address some of this risk. But is that what the financial market needs? Would that be seen as a stick and not as a carrot? That's another question. And then what does it mean from an investment perspective? ESG, could ESG be a opportunity? Potentially, yes. There's a lot of debate and discussion that we could have around ESG. But if if resilience could be infused with ESG, that could be opportunity to de-risk investment. But there are question marks if that's possible or not. Stress testing. We need to stress test infrastructure and the investment that go into infrastructure in itself, because it's not just about the asset. Most of the critical infrastructure assets are put in place for 60, 70 years, or sometimes 80 or 100 years. And risk is not static, it's dynamic. We cannot just do one risk assessment and wait for things to just mature on its own. We need to start stress testing those assets on a regular basis, because our upstream, downstream investments are also going on. And that's one way of looking at de-risking investment. Risk pricing, that's another issue. We need to look at it in a more accurate manner. There is a lot of effort in externalizing risk. We need to work with the financial market in internalizing them equally. It's not just the responsibility of where the investment is, which country, which location. It's also the responsibility of the investment decisions. And I'll just end by saying, it's also not. We have this issue around, it's type of issue where we are looking at building back better. Because there's a lot of investment going in reconstruction and rebuilding. Even post-COVID, there's a huge investment flow going in building back better. But do we really want to build back what there was, or do we need to transform and build future differently and more sustainably? And that needs to be looked at in a prospective manner. On the various actors, and I think that's a very broad question, Andy, because we would not only just need mayors and local government leaders, but we also need up the channel, the infrastructure ministries, the investors, the engineering community, the research community to start coming in and looking into these dimensions in a more holistic manner. I'll stop with that and back to you.
Thank you very much, Abhilash, and very pleased to hear that shout out from mayors. But build differently, better. You heard it here first, and trademarked then by the UN. I want to say thank you very much for those of you who are contributing questions in the chat. I see a question from Thomas Dolan, who had asked, is resilience a measurable quality and does it need to be? And I think some of those answers from Abhilash start to get into that with some of these issues around risk pricing and some of those tools that are being made available. I also see a question from Rajashri, who's asked about different data sources. I'll try and answer that in the chat. While Julia, I come to you, we identified this kind of gap in pre-feasibility funding some years ago now, and it's been great to work with you and World Bank and other agencies to kind of then implement Gap Fund. But tell us a little bit more about it and what it's there to do.
Yes, so the GAP Fund, as you said, is an initiative, a joint initiative by the EIB and the World Bank, and the EIB is delivering it in close collaboration with the German cooperation agency GIZ. It is funded by the German and Luxembourgish government, and the key idea, as you say, is exactly to focus on early stage project preparation, because we collectively potentially good ideas at the municipal level, particularly, sort of stay in a drawer and never make it to the stage where they are, implementable projects, or even mature enough to, get support for feasibility studies. So what we are targeting is all this gray area, and therefore we offer early stage technical support up to the pre-feasibility stage for urban and climate projects in low and middle income countries. So we have quite a wide definitions of sector. So any sector that according to the taxonomy and to EIB and World Bank and general consensus is considered as climate. And the type of technical assistance that we provide is really tailor-made to each of the requests that we received. We are demand-based. So we have a website, citygapfund.org, where all information is presented, and also on which we have the expression of interest form. We are trying to really focus on what is the most needed thing for the city at the time where they present their demand. This implies that, of course, the GAP Fund does not provide everything that is needed from the idea to the full pre-feasibility studies. We try to identify something that is really required and without which the project cannot go any further. And the other thing that we're trying to do as much as possible is to put these projects in contact with other project preparation facilities in order to ensure that when the GAP Fund support is finished, then somebody else can take the relay and take over for the remainder of the technical assistance, because intervening early on, of course, implies that the project is definitely going to need follow-up technical assistance. So we are trying to be additional to the panorama of project preparation facilities that is already there. Thank you.
Awesome. A very succinct explanation. And if I remember it right, the website is citygapfund.org. You can go there. There's a knowledge center and set of resources, as well as some more information about kind of where and for which types of projects and which stage of their life cycle, then they would be considered as eligible. So then, Tom, to round us out, I want to come back to you. Really, what do you see as the role of the engineering community in supporting project sponsors and investor decision making, and how can we effectively increase the level of engagement with the engineering community? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And yeah, the engineering community really is uniquely suited to understand climate-related impacts, associated risks and consequences, to infrastructure, and to the level of service to the people and communities that the infrastructure serves. Likewise, engineers are very well suited to take into consideration the full infrastructure life cycle, from planning and funding and investment stage to the design and construction, which of course includes the environmental impacts, GHG emissions, embodied carbon, et cetera, all the way through the long-term operations and maintenance and end of life, and all the associated emissions and carbon footprint that comes along with that, right through the potential reuse and repurposing or recycling of the infrastructure as a whole, or maybe in parts. and looking at all those different opportunities. This positioning and perspective that engineers have is extremely valuable as infrastructure investors and owners start to look at the pipeline of sustainable and resilient infrastructure projects and try to prioritize them, and also looking at associated and emerging climate-friendly technologies, equipment, and materials. So that's the good news about engineers and the great, very valuable perspective we bring. The not as good news is engineers are historically not as active or proactive in advocating and driving these changes. Typically, engineers have more frequently reacted to whatever scope of work they were provided or whatever task they were given, and designing it according to whatever applicable codes and standards may exist at the time. And we have to really completely change that paradigm. And we can change this dynamic, by helping engineers finding their voice and giving them a platform to take a more proactive leadership role, by coming together more effectively as a discipline and as really an industry, and leveraging engineering-oriented organizations at the local level, at the national level, and at the global level. And of course, in this latter case, organizations such as ICSI have been created. And I'm really proud to say that I've been involved with ICSI since its founding and continue to be involved. And one of the things that ICSI is partnering on with Resilience First as part of the Resilience Rising consortium of NGOs, and also involved with ICSI at the board level, is this creation of an engineering leadership group that was announced in a soft launch back in March on World Engineering Day. And the whole idea of this engineering leadership group is for engineers to engage in this advocacy more proactively when it comes to sustainable and resilient infrastructure in forums such as the G7, the G20, at COPs, et cetera. And I'm just very excited about this and look forward to seeing where it can go, and definitely invite anybody who's interested in learning more about that to follow up through ICSI and through Resilience First. So thanks, Andy.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. And very timely with the release of the latest G7 communique from discussions this afternoon, making very clear reference to the role of subnational leadership and opportunities to bring organizations that are linking city leaders together with both ICSI and the engineering leadership group will be absolutely fantastic. So maybe to offer some closing perspectives in that regard, another person who's been involved in ICSI since its very early days and inception, then Gunnar, over to you.
Thank you, Andy. It's my privilege to extend a heartfelt gratitude to all of you for joining us today on this very successful summit. Hope all of you have enjoyed the various presentations and the conversations as much as we have enjoyed putting it together for you. A special thanks to the speakers and the panelists for having contributed and shared a very candid thoughts on the various topics to make this a very successful event. I'm sure you've heard, from the various groups, from the policymakers through, the innovators, through the financiers, and those engaged in delivering a very sustainable and resilient infrastructure. It takes a village to deliver a very successful, sustainable, and resilient infrastructure. The underlying message that I got from listening to the various conversations is that infrastructure is here to help improve our quality of life. And it's not the other way around, where we serve the infrastructure. We need all hands on deck to meet the challenges of aging infrastructure, climate challenges, and the underinvestments to make sure that we're able to deliver on a promise of delivering a better quality of life. The ICSI Founding Summit was held in 2019, which brought together the doers and created a coalition to make a commitment of the ICSI Pledge. Since then, ICSI has grown significantly. We have delivered on seminal resources presented at COP26, have joined the Race to Resilient campaign, and have defined our strategic direction and more. Today's summit is a testament to ICSI's growth and progress and serves as a key milestone for ICSI and the engineering community ahead of COP27. With approximately over 700 registrants for the summit, it's very clear that the engineering community is hungry to meet and contribute to the challenges of the future of delivering a sustainable and resilient infrastructure. ICSI has been the central convener and is bringing more people, and I call for the challenge to ask you to join us in this movement to make sure that we deliver on a promise. We have heard from a number of folks, starting with Manuel Valdez Lopez, the councilman from Barcelona, on what the city of Barcelona is doing. Then we heard from Emily on nature-based solutions. And we also had from Lieutenant Colonel Brad McCoy on the standards that ASE is pulling together as forms as a guideline for the sustainable and resilient infrastructure. And I'm also very grateful to my fellow board members, Tom, Richard, and others who participated in this conversation. And also talk about Abhilash from the UNDRR and Julia from the European Investment Bank. So we've brought together a whole group of subject matter experts to share with you today on the various topics as to how we can all contribute to the future of making sure that it is not only sustainable and is resilient. I'd like to thank ICE for hosting the summit, and like to, last but not the least, thank the ICSI staff, Savina and her team, for having pulled this thing together at such a short notice. I now call on all of the attendees to continue to engage with ICSI through Race to Resilience campaign, convene, consult, use your social media, and keep the conversations going and keep the momentum, because the work is not done till we deliver on this promise to our fellow citizens, not only to preserve this planet, but to contribute to the sustainable and resilient infrastructure of the future. Thank you. Have a good day. We'll be in touch.
Thanks, Guna, and thanks, everybody. Take it easy. I hope you managed to clear the throat, and see everybody soon. Thank you. Bye.